Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. This time we're taking a look at Aboriginal societies in Canada.
A fascinating topic, for sure.
We're going to be focusing on three groups in particular, the Mi'kmaq,
Okay.
Haudenosaunee,
The Haudenosaunee.
and Anishinaabe.
Right.
And to really get into it, we've got a whole bunch of sources, briefing docs, study guides, FAQs,
Okay.
textbook excerpts, even a YouTube lecture series.
Really dug deep for this one, huh?
So are you ready to become an expert on Aboriginal societies in Canada?
Well, I'm ready to learn. Let's
Yeah.
do it. You know, one thing that really struck me going through these sources is how um, Canada's commitment to pluralism,
Mm-hmm.
to embracing diversity,
Right.
this idea has roots that go way back, even before Canada was, Canada.
Okay, so hold on. Before we go any further, I think we need to define pluralism.
Mm.
What does that mean in this context?
Yeah, good point. It's a big word, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
Pluralism basically means a society where different cultures, they can coexist. They're valued, they're respected for all their unique contributions, right?
Right.
And you can see that reflected in the First Nations in Canada. I
Right.
mean, the Mi'kmaq, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe.
Mm-hmm.
Each one has their own distinct culture,
Right.
but they were already living this idea of pluralism
Interesting.
long before Europeans arrived.
So it's kind of like how Canada is today, this multicultural society,
Right.
but with a much longer history.
Exactly. It's like a precedent.
Yeah.
And while these groups were very distinct, one thing our sources pointed out was they had some core values in common,
Okay.
like a really deep connection to nature,
Right.
respect for their elders,
Yeah.
a strong spiritual worldview.
Mm-hmm.
These were like themes that came up again and again.
That's like there's this common thread running through all three of these different cultures.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's start with the Mi'kmaq.
Okay.
One of the things that stood out to me was their location. They weren't just in one spot, right?
No, not at all. They were all over the woodlands and the coastlines of eastern Canada.
What?
So think places like Nova Scotia,
Okay.
Prince Edward Island,
Mm-hmm.
New Brunswick, even parts of Quebec.
Okay, so a pretty vast territory.
It was, and they had to be adaptable, right?
Yeah.
So they were skilled hunters and gatherers, but they were also excellent fishers.
So it seems like their environment really shaped their
Oh,
life style.
Absolutely. And one source even points out that their economic practices weren't just about survival.
Right.
It was intertwined with this deep respect for Mother Earth.
Okay.
They had this idea that you take only what you need, and that way you ensure that there's enough resources for generations to come.
So like sustainability was just built into their way of life. I'm kind of sensing a theme here.
Yeah, you're picking up on it for sure.
Okay. So let's talk about social structures, right? The Mi'kmaq, they had this clan system that I found really fascinating.
Clan system, yeah.
So each clan would have a leader, like a Sagamaw.
Right. The Sagamaw, yeah.
And they were responsible for guiding the members of their clan.
Exactly. But it wasn't just a bunch of clans, like, doing their own thing.
Right. They had a larger structure.
Yeah, definitely. So they were organized into 7 districts,
Good.
and each district had its own council.
Okay.
And then, get this.
Yeah.
If there was an issue that impacted the whole Mi'kmaq nation,
Mm-hmm.
they had a grand council.
Oh, wow. That's a serious level of organization. What I thought was super interesting is their decision-making process.
Okay.
Like, they were all about consensus.
Consensus, yeah.
It wasn't just like one person making decisions for everybody.
No. Imagine trying to decide, like, what kind of pizza to order with all your friends.
Okay.
And everyone has to agree.
Yeah.
That's kind of what it was like for the Mi'kmaq. They really valued everyone's opinion, and they wouldn't make a decision until they reached that consensus.
It's like democracy in action, but like centuries ago.
It really is.
And, from what I read, it wasn't just the men calling the shots.
No, you're right. Mi'kmaq women held a lot of influence,
Okay.
both within their families and in the community as a whole.
Okay, you're always.
Well, they participated in decision-making.
Okay.
They were responsible for education,
Mm-hmm.
and some sources even suggest they had a role in choosing the Sagamaw.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Really breaking stereotypes there. Okay, so we've learned that the Mi'kmaq had this really well-structured society,
Mm-hmm.
a really deep connection to nature, this emphasis on consensus and balance.
Yeah.
What's next on our cultural tour?
Well, let's move on to the Haudenosaunee.
Okay, the Haudenosaunee.
Now, this group, they originally lived north of the St. Lawrence River, but they ended up settling further south,
Okay.
around Lake Ontario. And, their agricultural practices were really innovative.
Is this where the Three Sisters comes in? I've always heard about the Three Sisters, but I've never really understood what it means.
That's it. The Three Sisters refers to corn, beans, and squash.
Okay.
And the Haudenosaunee, they were like masters at growing these three crops together in a way that it benefited all of them.
Like companion planting.
Exactly. So, for example, the corn stalks,
Yeah.
they acted as a natural support for the beans.
Okay.
The beans would add nitrogen to the soil.
Which is like plant food.
It is. And then the squash leaves, well, they helped retain moisture and prevent weeds.
That's so clever. It's like a natural ecosystem all in one garden plot.
It really is. And it wasn't just practical either. You see, the Three Sisters held this symbolic meaning for the Haudenosaunee.
Oh, okay.
They even have this creation story where the crops actually sprout from the grave of Sky Woman's daughter.
Wow. So it's woven into their spirituality, too.
Exactly. It's very holistic.
Okay, so what else stood out to you about the Haudenosaunee?
Well, their sense of community and how they managed their resources was, it was pretty amazing.
Okay.
The Haudenosaunee, they believed in communal ownership. So this was the idea that resources belong to everyone,
Right.
not just to individuals.
Right.
And so they shared based on need. And children and elders, well, they always took priority.
So it's like the opposite of every man for himself.
Yeah. It's about looking after one another, taking care of each other.
Okay. And this communal spirit, did it extend to their decision-making process as well?
Absolutely. They had these council meetings
Okay.
where they would discuss and debate, until they reached consensus, just like the Micmac.
Right. Now, I do remember reading that the Haudenosaunee were a matrilineal society, but to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what that means.
That's a good question. It's not a word you hear every day, is it?
Not really.
Basically, matrilineal means that lineage, ancestry and inheritance, it's all traced through the mother's line,
Okay.
not the father's.
So how did that impact their social structure?
Well, it had a huge impact. It meant that women, specifically the clan mothers, they had a lot of authority.
Wait, the women were in charge?
In a lot of ways, yes. Think of it this way. The clan mothers were like the heads of each longhouse.
Okay.
They controlled resources.
Right.
They had a say in choosing the male leaders.
Right.
And get this, they could even veto council decisions.
Oh, wow. So they had real power.
They did.
Yeah.
They were really seen as the backbone of the community.
That's amazing. Okay, and I have to ask about the Iroquois Confederacy. It sounds pretty intense.
Yeah, it's a fascinating part of their history. The Iroquois Confederacy was an alliance of 5, later 6 Haudenosaunee nations.
Wow.
And they had this incredible document called the Great Law of Peace,
Okay.
which basically acted as their constitution.
Oh, wow.
It laid out all these rules for how they would govern themselves and how they would behave.
So in a lot of ways, they were ahead of their time in terms of forming these alliances
Oh, absolutely.
and creating a system of laws to govern themselves.
Yeah, they're very sophisticated. And speaking of ahead of their time, we have to talk about the 7th generation principle.
Okay, yeah, that one really stood out to me.
It's remarkable, isn't it? They would actually consider the impact of their decisions on 7 generations into the future.
It's like playing the ultimate long game,
It is.
making sure that their actions wouldn't harm their descendants.
Yeah. Amazing foresight, right?
Yeah, it really makes you think about how we make decisions today. Like,
Yeah.
do we ever stop to think about the long-term consequences of what we're doing?
I think that's a question we all need to ask ourselves more often.
Okay, so we've covered the Micmac, we've covered the Haudenosaunee. What's next? The Anishinaabe.
You got it, the Anishinaabe. They're also known as the Ojibwe,
Okay.
and they mainly lived in the wooded areas of Ontario and Manitoba, but they later expanded westward. And one thing that makes them really unique is their relationship with wild rice.
Wild rice.
They called it mamonin,
Momentum. Okay.
and it was a central part of their way of life.
Interesting. I've heard that wild rice is incredibly nutritious, but I've never actually tried it. What's it like?
It's got this nutty, earthy flavor, and it was so important to the Anishinaabe. They even had specific rules and practices for harvesting it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, to make sure it stayed sustainable, which, if you're noticing a pattern here,
Yeah.
it's another example of their deep respect for nature.
Right. So sustainable harvesting, check. Respect for nature, check. What about their social structure? Did they have clans too?
Absolutely. They had a clan system as well. And each clan had specific responsibilities, for the well-being of the whole nation.
Okay.
And their leaders were chosen for their qualities, not just their lineage. So, for example, the Crane and Loon clans, they held specific leadership positions.
I'm seeing a lot of animal symbolism here.
Yeah, very
These are
connected to nature, right. And like the Haudenosaunee, they also emphasized balance and harmony. But they called it the Seven Grandfather Teachings.
right. The 7 grandfather teachings.
Hmm.
I remember reading about those. Wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth.
Yeah, those are values that I think resonate with just about anyone.
Oh, absolutely. Even today.
Yeah, they were seen as these guiding principles for living a good life
Okay.
and for maintaining a harmonious community. And one thing that really impressed me about the Anishinaabe was this emphasis on an equal partnership between men and women.
Okay, so similar to the Micmac in that way.
Yeah, similar, but each culture had its own nuances.
Right.
The Anishinaabe believed that men and women had distinct but equally important roles to play in society.
Okay.
Men were mainly responsible for hunting and protecting the community,
Okay.
while women focused on gathering, childcare, and maintaining the home.
It sounds like a pretty balanced system.
Yeah, they really strive for that balance.
Okay, so we've covered quite a lot about the unique aspects of these 3 different cultures.
We have.
But before we get into the impact of European contact,
Right.
I think there's one more common thread we should touch on.
Okay, what's that?
Oral history and traditional teachings.
Ah, yes. A fundamental difference from European societies at the time.
Right, because instead of relying on written records, they preserve their history, their beliefs, their values through these oral traditions.
Exactly. It was all passed down through storytelling, songs, ceremonies.
So storytelling was like their encyclopedia.
In a way, yeah. And the elders played a crucial role.
Okay.
They were the keepers of that knowledge,
Mhm.
sharing those stories and teachings with the younger generations.
And it wasn't just about memorizing facts, right?
No, not at all.
These stories were packed with deeper meaning.
Absolutely. They encoded cultural values,
Right.
life lessons.
Okay. And to help them remember, did they use anything?
Oh, yeah. Often they would use visual aids like wampum belts.
Wampum belts.
Yeah. These belts were woven with these really intricate patterns and symbols.
Okay.
And each one would represent a specific event or story.
It's like a tangible form of history.
Exactly. And one of the sources makes this really interesting point about the challenges of trying to translate these oral traditions into written English.
Yeah, that makes sense. It must be tough to, capture the nuances of a story, the cultural context, when you're switching between languages like that.
It is. And it's a good reminder that language and culture, they're so deeply connected.
Mhm.
And as we start to explore the impact of European contact,
okay.
well, we're going to see how this clash of cultures played out in some, pretty complex ways.
Okay, so this is where things are going to get a little heavy, I think.
Yeah.
But it's important to understand, right?
It is. It's not always easy to confront the past, but understanding what happened and why it happened,
Yeah.
it's crucial if we want to move forward in a positive way.
Well said. Let's dive in.
So as we start talking about, the arrival of Europeans, we have to acknowledge the complex and often tragic consequences that came with that. And our sources, they don't shy away from that.
Yeah. It's a sensitive topic.
Yeah.
But an important one. Where should we even begin?
Well, one thing that really jumped out at me was how European explorers and settlers, they often renamed First Nations people and places
Right.
with their own, worldview and biases.
It's almost like erasing their identity.
Exactly. Imposing their own. It might seem like a small thing, but it really speaks volumes.
Yeah. About the power dynamics at play. So, did this renaming happen with all 3 groups? The Mi'kmaq, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe?
It was a widespread practice, yeah. And, it went deeper than just names. When Europeans arrived, it was a clash of cultures, a clash of values. And it had a huge impact on traditional economies and ways of life.
One of the sources mentioned how European farming practices and technologies, it kind of disrupted the balance that the First Nations had so carefully maintained.
That's right. See, the introduction of new crops, livestock, farming methods, all of that often led to changes in land use.
Okay.
and how they managed resource. And sometimes it would disrupt traditional hunting and gathering practices, which had been, central to these cultures for centuries.
Right. And then there's the fur trade, too.
The fur trade, oh yeah, that had a big impact.
Initially, I imagine it must have offered some economic opportunities for First Nations, right?
It did at first, but ultimately it led to overhunting and competition for resources. And it created this dependence on European goods,
Oh, okay.
which further disrupted their traditional economies.
So it was kind of a slippery slope.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
What about the idea of land ownership? That must have been a huge point of contention.
Absolutely. The European concept of private land ownership, it was just completely foreign to First Nations.
Right.
They saw land as a shared resource,
Yep.
essential for the well-being of the whole community. So this fundamental difference in perspective, well, it led to conflict, it led to displacement, and ultimately, the loss of indigenous lands.
It's heartbreaking to think about the long-term consequences of those actions.
Right.
And it's not just about the physical loss of land, right?
I know, you're right.
It's also about the cultural and spiritual connections that were severed.
Exactly. The land wasn't just a place to live. It was intimately connected to their identity, their spirituality, their stories, their whole way of life.
It's hard to even imagine losing that.
It was devastating, and the impact is still felt today.
It's incredible, though, how these cultures, they faced all these challenges, yet they held on to so much of their knowledge and traditions.
It's a testament to their resilience, their adaptability. But we can't forget that many traditions were also lost or suppressed
Right.
because of government policies and, societal pressures, like the residential school system.
Yeah.
That was a deliberate attempt to assimilate Indigenous children,
It was.
stripping them of their language, their culture, their identity.
It's a dark chapter in our history. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the trauma caused by residential schools by these policies has had a lasting impact.
The very real impact that continues to this day. It's a reminder that reconciliation is an ongoing process,
Yeah.
It demands deep understanding, empathy, concrete actions to address those injustices.
So let's talk about reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what can we as individuals do to contribute to a more just and equitable future for Indigenous peoples in Canada?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think our deep dive here has given us some good insights. It starts with education. Learning the true history, understanding their cultures, their worldviews, and acknowledging the lasting impacts of colonialism.
And challenging our own biases and assumptions.
Exactly. We all have biases, whether we realize it or not.
It's true.
We have to be aware of them and actively work on unlearning those harmful stereotypes, prejudices.
Okay. So it's about listening, learning, reflecting. What else can we do?
Well, supporting Indigenous-led initiatives is huge. There are so many organizations and communities doing amazing work, to revitalize languages, reclaim traditions, advocate for their rights.
Right.
We can support them through donations, volunteering, even just spreading awareness about their work.
One of the sources talked about the importance of amplifying Indigenous voices. I think that's really powerful.
It is creating space for those voices to be heard, not speaking for them, but letting them speak for themselves.
Right. Like supporting Indigenous authors and artists, activists, leaders, seeking out their perspectives,
Yeah,
amplifying their messages.
exactly.
It's funny, as we've been talking, I keep thinking back to those shared values we discussed earlier. The connection to nature, respect for elders, that emphasis on balance and harmony. It makes me think, we could all benefit from these ideas.
I agree. There's so much wisdom there.
I'm curious, have any of these cultures managed to adapt their traditional knowledge to modern-day challenges?
Oh, there are some inspiring examples in our sources. One that comes to mind is the Wabuno Fish Farm on Manitoulin Island.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, it's a community-owned and operated business.
Okay.
They raise rainbow trout,
Okay.
but they use cutting-edge technology, sustainable practices, and they draw on Anishinaabe principles of environmental stewardship.
Wow. So they're combining traditional knowledge with modern innovation.
They are, and it's creating a thriving business that benefits the whole community.
That's fantastic. It's a good reminder that reconciliation isn't just about addressing past wrongs, right?
No.
It's about creating opportunities for Indigenous communities to thrive today.
To thrive in the future, recognizing their resilience, their ingenuity,
Yeah.
their incredible contributions to Canada's diverse cultural landscape.
Okay, we've covered a lot.
We have.
Anything else from our mountain of sources that you think we should touch on before wrapping up?
Well, one thing that stayed with me was this passage about the importance of storytelling. for preserving cultural memory and identity. You know, how stories can act as these bridges between generations, connecting the past, present, and future.
It's a beautiful way to put it. It makes me think how much we can all learn from listening to the stories of others, especially those who have been marginalized or silenced.
Exactly. Stories have this power to build empathy, to challenge perspectives, to inspire us to create a more just and equitable world.
Well said.
It's been eye-opening.
I feel like I've learned so much.
Challenging, inspiring.
Yeah, it really has. And it's just the beginning of our journey, right?
Absolutely. There's always more to learn, more to understand, more ways we can contribute to reconciliation.
So as we wrap up part 2 of this deep dive, what's one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
The biggest thing for me is recognizing that reconciliation is not a destination.
Oh.
It's a journey. It's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
It demands that all of us be engaged, informed, and committed to creating a better future.
Well said. And that brings us to the end of part 2 of our deep dive into Aboriginal societies in Canada. We'll be back soon with part 3, where we'll explore some final thoughts and reflections on everything we've learned. Until then, keep exploring. Welcome back. Thinking about everything we talked about in the last 2 parts,
Yeah.
it's amazing.
It really.
These cultures weren't just surviving, they were thriving.
Absolutely.
These intricate societal structures,
Yeah.
this deep understanding of the natural world.
It's impressive.
Really impressive.
Like, take the 7th generation principle.
Right.
Thinking about the impact of decisions 7 generations into the future.
Yeah, what would the world look like if we all did that?
Seriously.
It's mind-blowing.
It would fundamentally change how we approach everything.
Yeah.
Every
Environmental policy,
economic development.
social justice issues.
All of it.
Imagine making decisions with the well-being of 7 generations in mind.
It would shift our priorities for sure.
Yeah, and it's not just that, right? It's this emphasis on balance,
Balance, yeah.
harmony, respect for elders,
These are values that we need today.
more than ever.
Absolutely.
Prepping for this deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
what really stood out to me was the diversity.
The sheer diversity of
Yeah.
indigenous cultures.
In Canada.
Yeah, even just the 3 we focused on.
The Mi'kmaq, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinabe.
3 very different groups.
Yeah, and each one.
Each one with its own unique traditions, beliefs.
Ways of life.
It's a reminder that indigenous isn't this monolithic term.
Right, right.
There's so many different cultures.
So many.
Each one
With its own...
with its own rich history, traditions.
Exactly. And that's something we should celebrate that.
We should.
Respect that.
Absolutely.
As we wrap up,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just in awe
I am too.
at the resilience
The resilience.
and the ingenuity of these cultures.
Incredible. And, I also feel this responsibility to
Yeah.
keep learning.
To learn more?
To challenge my own biases.
Yeah.
To do what I can.
To contribute to that more just and equitable future.
For Indigenous people in Canada.
Yeah, and reconciliation.
It's a journey, not a destination.
It's a process,
It is.
and we all need to be a part of it.
Engaged, informed, committed to that better future. For everyone.
It's about listening to Indigenous voices.
Amplifying their stories.
Mm-hmm.
Supporting their self-determination.
Yeah, and
Recognizing the injustices of the past.
working toward a future
Through Indigenous cultures.
where these cultures
pointy.
aren't just tolerated,
You're right.
but celebrated.
Celebrate it as
alongside.
a core part of Canada's identity.
Exactly. And to our listener,
Yeah.
keep exploring.
Keep learning
Dive into the history, the culture
of the First Nations.
in your own region.
Visit a museum.
Attend an event.
Connect with an Indigenous-led organization.
Be open.
Be open to learning,
Unlearning.
relearning.
This journey of reconciliation.
Yeah,
It's one we take together.
we do.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.